if neglected figure, Henryk Grossman, whose presence in the Frankfurt School originates from prior to Horkheimer's becoming its director, and who nevertheless played an important, if more or less independent, role within it. The question that we hope to isolate is, what is the Frankfurt School's historically fluctuating yet orthodox Marxism? And with that, a warm welcome again to Spencer and Danny.
So this is working. So I'm going to read a text. May take a little while. And then Danny and I will take questions together. He and I are working on a short book on this subject. So the book may take some time to write, but this is, in a sense, the book proposal. It's also going to be really just a couple of draft fragments. I'm going to talk today mainly about the new left reception of the Frankfurt School. Some of that will be familiar to you from Stefan's teaching on Saturday and the reception of Marcuse and Adorno. And in the second part, I'm going to, at least in a preliminary way, specify Henryk Grossman's project, really in the early Frankfurt School, before Horkheimer becomes the director. Okay, with that. So what, if anything, is the point of the critique of political economy? Or, as is sometimes stated, Marxist economics? What good is it now? What good was it in the past in Marx's hands, in those of Second International theoreticians like Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg? How did it fare after the collapse of Marxism in the wake of the October Revolution in the 1920s and 30s, in the post-war world? Now, and why? Relatedly, what is the relationship between Marxist materialism and Marxist economics? Is Marx's critique of political economy Marx's central work, or at least his central work of dialectical materialism, whatever that is? Is it his most scientific work? If so, how? And what relationship does the critique of political economy bear to the rest of Marx's writing and his political activity? Is the thing to do, if you want to understand Marx and Marxism, to join a Capital reading group? What, if anything, does understanding Capital, that sprawling corpus of material, have to do with the project of socialist revolution? Why did Gramsci describe the October Revolution of 1917 as the revolution against capital? Double entendre fully intended. Back in 2021, I consulted to a significant degree with Danny and with Aaron as they went through what must surely be considered the core of the corpus of the critique of political economy, volumes 1 through 3 of Capital. At the conclusion of that endeavor, at the 2021 U.S. East Coast Regional Conference, they delivered a brilliant teach-in on that subject, one that I strongly recommend. That teach-in, as well as Stefan's teach-in on Saturday on Marcuse, not to mention the many panels Platypus has hosted on the politics of critical theory, as well as the strong collection of articles to be found on the subject of the Frankfurt School, as well as on the subject of Marxist economics in the Platypus Review, together form the key background to my remarks here. We in Platypus focus on the seminal figures in the Frankfurt School, above all Adorno. Or to the extent that we consider the Frankfurt School, we think almost exclusively of Horkheimer's Institute. And we think of it, not incorrectly, as a vision or a nexus of collaboration more than as a historical institution that might have been located somewhere in Frankfurt or in New York City. But consideration of Grossman prompts us to think about the Frankfurt School prior to Horkheimer, into the Frankfurt School of Felix Weil and Karl Grunberg, the original institute of the 1920s, and its continuity with that of Horkheimer in the 1930s, 40s, and beyond. Grossman's association with the institute originates from a time prior to Horkheimer's direction, and Grossman nevertheless played, both before and after Horkheimer became director, an important, if more or less independent role within it, until finally he breaks with it, and it with him, sometime in the early 1940s. Consideration of this figure, a Polish Jewish Marxist who served as an important political leader in Galicia in the Revolution of 1905 and the years immediately afterwards, not only provokes the vein of questions raised above respecting the critique of political economy, even Marxist economics, it throws the Frankfurt School's Marxism into starker relief. That is, Grossman as a figure subjected until recently to historiographical oblivion allows us to pose another seemingly settled question, namely, what was critical theory? I.e., not a supposedly ongoing academic endeavor that carries on today, but the original enterprise of the first generation of the Frankfurt School from the 1920s through the 1960s. How was it Marxist, even orthodox? These are core questions that our short book will address via the work of Henryk Grossman, especially with reference to his 1929 chef d'oeuvre, The Law of Accumulation and Breakdown of the Capitalist System, being also a theory of crises. To anticipate my conclusion now, however bluntly, still for clarity's sake, we contend that Grossman's concerns with orthodoxy, with the critique of political economy, etc., and how he pursued those concerns, in no way sat uneasily with Horkheimer's direction of the Frankfurt School, as is presently maintained, and that when Horkheimer and Grossman did come into conflict, this was because over the impossible course of the 1930s, Grossman abandoned Marxism. But why address these dusty old matters now? What occasion is there for this? As presently conceived, the project that Danny and I have embarked upon takes up Grossman in his own time, especially the time during which he was affiliated with the Institute for Social Research, the 1920s to 1930s. He was already a fully mature man by that time. He was in his 40s when he joined. But it also addresses the memory of, the falsification of, the Frankfurt School by the New Left and now by the millennials. So the first and most immediate occasion is simple, seemingly trivial. The past 2 decades have quietly witnessed the labors of Australian Marxist Rick Kuhn to substantially rediscover and represent to a global English readership this figure who had fallen into obscurity within the history of Marxism. After an unlikely success, relatively speaking, as far as Marxist publications are concerned, of Kuhn's 2006 biography of Grossman, published by, of all places, the University of Illinois Press, Kuhn has since partnered with historical materialism to follow the political intellectual biography up with a series of studies and of 4 substantial and ably translated volumes, the last of which appeared last year. Of these 4, the most significant is the 3rd, which appeared in 2021, a complete translation undertaken with Jairus Banerjee of the law of accumulation and breakdown of the capitalist system. This is a late work of the New Left. Back in 1992, Pluto Press had published an abridged translation of this work, and mimeographed copies of it have circulated since the late 1970s. And that itself was an international reflex of the rediscovery of Grossman by the German New Left. Grossman was, for instance, republished in the 1960s in German in 1969, his lengthy essay, Marx, Classical Economics and the Problem of Dynamics, which I think was originally written in English maybe, and in 1970, his masterwork, Accumulation and Breakdown. Still, it's only now, in the 2020s, that there is available, at least for an English readership, what was, as it happens, both the first and the most widely read book of the pre-war period published by the Frankfurt School. The other 3 volumes that Kuhn has brought out supply the essays, the book reviews, the political pamphlets, and the correspondence that, taken together, substantially round out the picture of Grossman's political and intellectual trajectory over a period of roughly 4 decades, from the 1905 revolution to the mid-1940s, by which point the world socialist revolution lay in the ruins of fascism, the New Deal, Stalinism, and World War. As with so many of the products of historical materialism, its conferences and its book series, Kuhn's translations and studies represent a late realization of an impulse reaching back to the late 1960s. So the completion of Kuhn's work of interpretation and translation is one occasion. Another is that of a young socialist, Ted Rees, who has drawn on Kuhn's work to popularize Grossman's thought amongst the millennial generation, publishing The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Henryk Grossman in 2022. He's appeared on a number of podcasts to promote this book, making at least Grossman's name familiar to the new generation of leftist intellectuals that has sprung up in recent decades. So here we have a clear instance of, on the one hand, a substantial political intellectual preoccupation of the New Left translated to and reproduced by the millennials, despite, but also authorized by, the thorough historical contextualization that Kuhn provides in his 2006 intellectual biography. Rees presents a Grossman ripped from the political historical context that renders his thought intelligible, never mind critical. Instead, readers are now supplied with a Henryk Grossman of immediate and therefore hopelessly obscure relevance. Grossman is relevant because he's a theoretician of economic crisis, we are told. And this is a defining concern of the millennial generation. Which brings me to the other occasion of this project of ours, the seemingly perennial relevancy of economic crisis and breakdown in capitalism. This, even though we might say that the economic crisis the economic crisis of 2008, is it the economic crisis of neoliberalism? Has passed. The death of the millennial left seemingly renders that crisis interminable, as they seem to have drawn nothing from their experience, but only return eternally to the reposed question, why can't we have good things? And the contradictory demand, burn it all down. A longtime member of Socialist Alternative, itself a successor to the Cliffite International Socialist Organization in Australia, Rick Kuhn was 18 years old in 1973, the crisis year that marked the definitive end of the 1960s, which confirmed the New Left in its Marxist and sectarian impulses. 1973 was also the year the Frankfurt School director, of Frankfurt School director Max Horkheimer's death, and of the publication of the first major historical study of the Frankfurt School, Martin Jay's Dialectical Imagination. On Saturday, Stefan spoke of the betrayal of Marcuse and of the Frankfurt School, not only by its critics, but by its supposed friends. Perhaps despite themselves, the New Left could produce no genuine students of the Frankfurt School, only disciples, critics, or perhaps most commonly, distorters. Of course, Adorno in Germany, and even more, if perhaps less productively so, Marcuse in the United States, helped to fructify the New Left in the 1950s and 60s. As Marcuse wrote to Adorno in April 1969, we cannot deny that these students have been influenced by us. At that time, the Frankfurt School was engaged with a kind of openness. Certainly in Germany, pirated editions of the Dialectic of Enlightenment circulated from hand to hand in the 1960s. American New Leftist Paul Buell captured something of this openness as late as 1969, observing in an underground magazine published in Madison, Wisconsin, what separates the Frankfurt School from the better-known Marxists is their willingness to call into question the supposed gains of the 20th century. The New Left, before its defeat, or rather before the repression of its defeat, were prepared to recognize that radicals looked glibly, again I'm quoting Buell, radicals looked glibly to the proletarian mass to throw off its chains, not comprehending the very notion of mass, never mind the simultaneous transformation of culture into a system of regimentation, carrying its own contradictions. Buell adds that for him, the Frankfurt School represents a denial of baseless optimism and the necessity for a full understanding of modern civilization in the face of the emergence of totalitarianism everywhere, unquote. If the engagement with the Frankfurt School was formative, the defeat of the New Left in the 1970s, as Christopher Lasch observed at the time, gave added urgency to the questions raised by the Frankfurt School, unquote. Only then did the New Left genuinely attempt to settle accounts with their teachers, albeit generally to no good effect. In the dozen years or so after Jay's relatively liberal and thus relatively untortured dialectical imagination, major studies of the Frankfurt School were published by, to name a few, Tom Bottomore, Helmut Dubil, Andrew Feenberg, David Held, Phil Slater, Gillian Rose, Alphonse Zollner, Zoltan Tar, Goran Tergorn, and many others. Others like Moishka Stone and Adolf Reed framed their own work in dialogue with the tradition of critical theory. As far as the English language is concerned, in the same period, a thorough translation of a foundation of texts was made available beyond what Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse had originally composed in English. These translations of articles appeared in journals such as Telos, and book-length translations were undertaken of the Dialectic of Enlightenment, of aspects of sociology, of critical theory, of the Critique of Instrumental Reason, and Dawn and Decline. This growing literature reached a kind of plateau with Andrew Orato and Eike Gebhardt's Essential Frankfurt School Reader in 1982, which was further complemented in '89 by Stephen Bronner and Douglas Kellner's Critical Theory in Society, a Reader. Parallel to this, of course, a so-called second generation of the Frankfurt School was elaborated over the course of the 1970s by, above all, my former professor, Jürgen Habermas. His two-volume magnum opus, The Theory of Communicative Action, appeared in 1981. The New Left was thus intellectually formed in close and intimate struggle with the Frankfurt School. From 60s activism through the 70s downturn and Marxist turn, leading on into the left academicism of the post-political decades. The Frankfurt School tugged at the New Left's conscience. Needless to say, to the extent that we are unconscious of this New Left inheritance, we can only be beholden to it. The New Left's agonized relationship with, ultimately rejection of, the Frankfurt School is foundational to the institutionalization of the academic left in the 1980s, alongside, if less visibly, to its unacknowledged counterpart, the sectarian left. To engage with the Frankfurt School subsequently, whether one wills it or not, is thus to re-inhabit the New Left's struggle to come to terms with it. It's to re-inhabit the debates of the 1970s, in, for instance, the journal Telos. What is ultimately at stake is the task and irrelevance of the would-be Marxist intellectual after Stalinism, that is, after the self-liquidation of Marxism. The original Frankfurt School remained a kind of touchstone, one that the New Left had perforce to reject, yet could never get over. That, in effect, Adorno, Horkheimer, Pollock, and Marcuse had no students, despite every New Left intellectual, in some sense, passing through their classrooms actually or virtually, remains to be confronted. From the first, the notion of any genuine continuity with Horkheimer and Adorno on the one hand and Habermas on the other was decidedly misleading, and yet to his credit, figures like Habermas never really claimed a fundamental commonality. As Adorno biographer Detlef Clausen observes of their relationship, Habermas had his own theoretical projects, and in 1964 he became a young colleague of Adorno's with his own charisma and his own power to attract. In terms of university politics, his views harmonized with Adorno's, but at the level of theory, there really was no meeting of the minds. In 1991, Habermas stated, "I don't think Adorno ever read a book by me." The agonistic quality of the relationship between the New Left and the Frankfurt School was, of course, already flamed by the 1960s. As Adorno remarked of one of his best students, Hans-Jürgen Krahl, if you were to see him in a seminar, you would not think it was the same person as the man who shouts through the megaphones. There's probably something pathological about this divided identity. He had scarcely finished his speech before turning to me and whispering that he hoped I wouldn't take it amiss, since it was purely political and not meant personally. Habermas's trajectory seemed to confirm Krahl's implied critique of the Frankfurt School that it hadn't kept faith with revolution, with Marxism. After all, Habermas became a liberal. Many of the aging New Left surmised this was because the Frankfurt School abandoned materialism, understood as an abandonment of Marxist economics. A version of this argument was taught to me in the classroom in the 1990s and 2000s by Moïse Stone. For Moïse, the Frankfurt School, in the face of Stalinism, the New Deal, and fascism, could no longer grasp capitalism as contradictory. Try as they might, they could not maintain their Marxism. Postone, to my knowledge, never addressed Grossman, hinging his argument respecting the supposed impasse of the Frankfurt School on the so-called Pollock thesis on state capitalism. But Kuhn's Grossman is the left-wing alternative to the conservative, because supposedly pessimistic, Frankfurt School, described by Postone. That somehow the failure of the Frankfurt School, their supposed taking up of residency in the Grand Hotel Abyss, as Lukács later put it, had to do with their misprision of Marx's capital, holds together these two otherwise disparate new leftists. For Kuhn, no less than Postone, the Frankfurt School turns to the right because of the inadequacy of its grasp of the critique of political economy. The revisionist dispute is the great ideological crisis in the history of Marxism. one that continued to be prosecuted until Marxism's collapse. A collapse that, to the extent that they acknowledge it, Marxists can only understand as the triumph of revisionism. Of course, in Marx and Engels' time, there were disputes with other socialisms. Marxism is intrinsically, so to speak, a critique of socialism. The utopian socialists, the Jacobin socialists, and later Lassalleans and anarchists, to name a few, constituted the object within and against which Marx and Engels mounted their eminent dialectical or proletarian critique of socialism. But revisionism emerged from within Marxism itself. And until Marxism's demise, the revisionist dispute remained the framework within which the Marxist critique of Marxism, and thus Marxism's pursuit of world revolution, was staged. This reached its apex in Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin's criticism of Karl Kautsky in the wake of the October Revolution. Though that apex in crisis persisted in a quasi-political form through the 1920s and 30s in Trotsky's critique of Stalinism. Grossman's interpreter, Rick Kuhn, neatly resolves the question of the revisionist dispute by treating it as simply as a failing of a first generation of Marxists. For him, particularly after Friedrich Engels died in 1895, the dominant orthodoxy of the International tended to focus on organization, personified in the deeds of social democratic parliamentarians, trade union officials, and party leaders, as an end in itself, rather than on class struggle as a means of transforming mass consciousness and society. Kuhn's sectarian leader, Tony Cliff, in the second volume of his study of Lenin, can only speak of the Marxists of the Second International in scare quotes. For him, and we saw this in the plenary on Saturday, where the Second International was simply treated as a synonym for reformism. For Cliff, the Second International, emerging during the period of the slow, organic, systematic growth of capitalism and the labor movement, in practice limited itself to the question of tactics, to the tasks of the day-to-day struggle for reforms in the trade unions, in parliament, local government bodies, cooperatives, etc. And for Kuhn, thus as for Cliff, the issue of revisionism is resolved into a question of revolutionary will. We saw this, as I say, over the weekend. The question of how, so to speak, to be a Marxist intellectual was thrown into crisis by the October Revolution. The question, in short, of how to prosecute the revisionist dispute. This was manifest in how, for instance, no Marxist theoreticians of the stature of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg emerged in and through the revolutionary crisis of 1917 to 1919. At the same time, an immense number of intellectuals across Europe and to a lesser degree North America were attracted, or indeed worldwide, were attracted to Marxism in the aftermath of the October Revolution. While Trotsky was making his bid for leadership to inherit the type of intellectual theoretician and revolutionary party leader role from Lenin, in Central Europe especially, innumerable brilliant intellectuals were attracted to Marxism, including to Trotskyism, but also to council communism and other forms of left critique of the crisis of Marxism. The type and the dilemma of the new Marxist intellectualism appears unmistakably in 1923 in the work of Gerd Lukács and Karl Korsch. And, as is well known, the authors of History and Class Consciousness and Marxism and Philosophy, respectively, were not unreservedly embraced by the communist movement at the time. Indeed, at its 5th Congress in 1924, held in the aftermath of the defeat of the German October the year before, the leader of the Comintern, Grigory Zinoviev, summarily denounced the work of both men. In his speech, The Struggle Against the Ultra-Lefts and Theoretical Revisionism, the Bolshevik theoretician declared, "If we get more of these professors spinning out their Marxist theories, we shall be lost," unquote. While keen to side with the left against the right within the German Communist Party, because they judged the party's assessment of conditions leading to October 1923 to have been mistaken, the right's assessment of conditions to have been mistaken, Zinoviev nevertheless underscores the dangers of ultra-leftism, distinguishing between responsible proletarian elements and irresponsible bourgeois intellectuals. Lukács embodied the crisis in that sense. He was not engaged in the revisionist dispute, exactly. Rather, he had undertaken a kind of philosophical meta-critique of the history of Marxism as a whole, grasping orthodoxy as the reassertion of the Marxian dialectic in the face of Marxism's own reification. His was, so to speak, an explication of why the Orthodox declared revisionists to be undialectical. As Russell Jacoby noted nearly half a century ago, the efforts of Lukács and of Korsch, and after them of the Frankfurt School, were towards salvaging what threatened to become a lost dimension of Marxism, its subjective element. It was simultaneously an assertion of orthodoxy and an expression of the crisis of the revisionist dispute itself. Zinoviev's condemnation grasped in its own way this aspect of Lukács' work. Lukács himself would, for a few years at least, continue to uphold his insights, achieved through the historical experience of revolution, his insights respecting Marxism, writing the unpublished Taylism and the Dialectic in defense of his own position. But in the end, not only Lukács, but all the professors spinning out their Marxist theories had to take note of the crisis of communism. It was against the background of Lukács and Korsch's publication and the left's defeat most proximally in 1923, and thus the definitive emergence of Stalinism and the definitive crisis of intellectualism within the party, that the Frankfurt School was originally founded. In 1923, the wealthy Marxist Felix Weil organized the first Marxist work week, a kind of conference and retreat for eminent Marxist intellectuals, including Lukács, Korsch, Friedrich Pollock, Richard Sorge, Konstantin Zetkin, and Karl August Wittvogel, among others. Weil's hope for the symposium was that it afforded an opportunity of talking it out together, that those present might intellectually advance or somehow deepen Orthodox Marxism. But the following year, rather than repeat the Marxist work week, a more ambitious plan of creating a permanent institute for Marxist intellectual endeavor was undertaken, with Karl Grunberg as director. As Marco Torres of the Platypus Affiliated Society has written, the goal was to maintain the critical purchase of Marxian critique, even as it was threatened by an accelerated process of decay in the 1920s. As otherwise enemy of the Frankfurt School, Perry Anderson had to acknowledge, albeit in rather idiosyncratic terms, Leninism was no sooner diffused outside of Russia than it was sterilized by the Stalinization of the Third International, and the social democratic or central parties outside of the Comintern naturally offered no space for the application or extension of Leninism either. Consequently, an independent institute of social research was created at Frankfurt to promote Marxist studies within a quasi-academic framework. The Frankfurt School was thus founded as an acknowledgement of the degradation of party conditions in a context of political retreat. During the Second International, contempt with academic engagement with Marxism was, so to speak, proverbial. The designation of, I can't pronounce German properly, Katheder Sozialist, professorial socialist, expressed the contempt that intellectuals like Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg had for the entire notion of teaching Marxism in the university. At the same time, the Second International cultivated intellectuals qua intellectuals like Kautsky, Bernstein, Plekhanov, and others. This was no longer to be. Now the retreat into something like academic respectability was enforced. In 1923, Henryk Grossman joined the newly established institute in Frankfurt. Before the war, Grossman had studied with Grunberg. Now, at age 44, he was at the height of his intellectual powers. His Accumulation and Breakdown was, as I say, the Institute's most influential work, unmistakably the most widely read and widely reviewed work published by the Frankfurt School during the interwar years. As Kuhn wrote, the book attracted immensely more attention than the other monographs in the series issued by the Institute for Social Research. Despite its mainly hostile reception, until the 1940s, it was better known than the research of the Institute's other active members. Already in the period 1923 to 1924, Grossman, in parallel with Lukács and Korsch, grasped Marx's critique of political economy as a recognition of socialism as the leading symptom of the crisis of bourgeois society. As he wrote in 1923, very much in the spirit of Lukács and of Korsch, we are still only starting to analyze Marx's system today. Engels had only completed the third edition of Capital some 30 years before, in 1894. And the fourth volume of Capital had only appeared in the years 1905 to 1910. By the time it had been fully published, Capital was far ahead of its time for Grossman, anticipating in theory the development of the world economy over the subsequent decades, unquote. At the time of its publication, the gray masses of the proletariat, for whose struggle it was to be the scientific expression and guide, were too oppressed by the weight of capitalist exploitation to be able to think in terms of so distant a future. Thus, Marx's work had gone largely undigested, not least because of the growing reformism within the international socialist movement. Indeed, the leading students of Marx's critique of political economy were themselves affirmative, converting Marxism into a positive theory. Quote, despite the reality that the whole world goes through catastrophic and tragic shocks, pseudo-Marxists like Hilferding, Kautsky, and Otto Bauer's theories revolve around the harmonious development of capitalism. Marx's theory, which was a contribution to the critique of capitalism, they transformed into a pseudo-theory praising capitalism, taking it back to the level of a pre-Marxist theory, a la Jean-Baptiste Say, Claude Frédéric Bastiat, and Henry Charles Carey. As Grossman recognizes, the fear of the practical consequences of the science threatened to be a theoretical reflection of real phenomena, resulting in the imposition of a priori restrictions on these theoretical attempts. In other words, retreat from Marx's Marxism drove the comprehension of society back into pre-Marxian thought, as socialism retreated into a vulgarization of political economy. In the hands of the revisionists, as Grossman emphasized, Marxian economics retreated into ethics and to demands for justice. Compared to the revisionist dispute over Marx's politics, the heart of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky's concerns. The legacy of capital, of Marx's critical comprehension of society, had been largely handed over to the revisionists. The partial exceptions were, of course, Kautsky, and especially Rosa Luxemburg. The heart of Breakdown's argument addresses not so much economics as Marx's method. The first thing to understand about Grossman's law of accumulation and breakdown is that it's not even really an interpretation of Marx. As he says, it would be a useless task to increase the dogmas surrounding Marxism with a new interpretation and to simply reinforce the view that Marxism has become a matter of interpretation. The issue is rather one of advancing the revolutionary position within the existing dispute. This demands following Lukács's insight respecting the centrality of method. Paraphrasing Lukács, Grossman laments at the opening of his text that in the debate theretofore, the whole question of Marx's method had been ignored. There has been a general tendency to cling to the results of the theory. These have been the focal point of interest on the part of both critics and defenders. In all this, the method has been totally ignored. So what Grossman sets out to do is to deepen engagement with Marx's critique of political economy within the existing debate over it in the revisionist dispute. Thus, he undertakes a reinterpretation of Marx by renouncing interpretation in favor of prosecuting a return to Marx. Specifically, Grossman seeks to bring Marx to bear upon his present moment through an imminent dialectical critique of his own master and Marx's greatest orthodox defender within the Second International, Rosa Luxemburg. The law of accumulation and breakdown is thus an attempt to bring Marx to bear on Marxism via the history of Marxism's struggle over Marx via Luxemburg. As is well known, the revisionist argument staked economics out as its chosen theoretical ground. This is why Antonio Gramsci remarked in 1917 that Marx's Capital was a book of the bourgeoisie more than of the proletariat. He meant that this was the book on which the revisionists had taken their ground. After the SPD explicitly repudiated the revisionist position at their 1903 party conference, revisionists, of course, had largely ceased to argue against the political goal of the revolutionary institution of the dictatorship of the proletariat. To the extent, however, that they continued to openly elaborate their argument, this was largely accomplished through recondite discussions of economics. This is where orthodoxy most signally failed. Quote, "The lofty self-contained structure of Marx's thought has, to use an expression of Luxemburg's, been reduced to a dust heap in which the fragments of all systems, splinters of thought from great and small minds, have found their collective tomb. This is true of all Marxist exponents of Marx's critique of political economy. Kautsky as much as Bernstein, Hilferding as much as Eckstein, Baudin as much as Chorosov, and not excluding Rosa Luxemburg herself." Kautsky is still a giant, according to Grossman. And even as a critic of the inadequacies of the accumulation of capital, Grossman is a self-professed disciple of Rosa Luxemburg. Still, orthodoxy demanded that Marx's Marxism in Capital be vindicated. This gesture is similar in many respects to Lukács's critique of Engels, and specifically Engels' treatment of philosophical dialectics in History and Class Consciousness. Thus, in his criticism of Bukharin as a contemporary communist vulgarizer, Grossman writes, "Bukharin's interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy is false, just as false as Kautsky's and Luxemburg's attempts at interpretation." The prevailing reception of the law of accumulation and breakdown, Kuhn and Ries's interpretation, takes Grossman's to be a simple work of Marxist economics in the affirmative post-war mode. That is, it's assimilated to the intellectual environment that, with the exception of the Frankfurt School and perhaps the most self-conscious expressions of sectarian Marxism, has come to be naturalized after the definitive end of the workers' movement for socialism in the core capitalist countries. For that reason, the book's point of departure, its identification and exploration of the stakes of previous discussion of Marxist theory of accumulation and breakdown, is passed over by these interpreters in silence in favor of an exploration of a theory of supposed general validity. Indeed, the work's identification of its object, of capitalism's latest imperialist phase, is no less ignored than the book's self-designation as a contribution to the revisionist dispute. But for Grossman in the 1920s, the struggle against revisionist Marxism, the crisis of international communism, was as yet unresolved. He continued to write in this mode until about 1932, when he pens a kind of coda to Breakdown, in which he places that work in the context of what he terms the half-century-long struggle for orthodoxy. The question at the heart of the law of accumulation and breakdown is whether capitalism necessarily breaks down, whether capitalist expansion runs into limits which it cannot overcome. This is demonstrated as on the basis of a single principle, Marx's law of value, so as to supply an explanation of all the phenomena of capitalism without recourse to any special ad hoc theory. For Grossman, unlike his followers, there is no privileging of materialist economics over subjective politics. What they neglect is the fact that within the revisionist dispute, there is already an extensive literature on the political revolution, and it's the economic side of the problem that's been neglected theoretically, at least for Grossman. For him, the revisionist dispute was only adequately prosecuted to the extent that it was adequately prosecuted in the political domain. What does this mean? Revisionist Marxism abandons Marxism in the name of class struggle. As Grossman argues, Hilferding, Karasov, Branthal, they reject the theory of breakdown because, in their view, such a theory proceeds from the mechanical idea that the end of capitalism will come about of itself. That is, it has to be awaited fatalistically, and therefore seems to be incompatible with Marxist theory of class struggle. The revisionists maintain that if the breakdown theory is conceded, then any class struggle for goals in the present, for the improvement of the working class's situation, is basically pointless, unquote. Thus, of course, revisionism rejects Marxism in order to save socialism. The goal of the breakdown of capitalism had to be abandoned to preserve the movement. In the face of Stalinism, that might have gone over your heads. The goal is the breakdown of capitalism, right? The theory of the breakdown of capitalism is also a theory of capitalism's tendency to socialism. Right? So the goal, the goal of the breakdown of capitalism in that sense had to be abandoned to preserve the movement. In the face of Stalinism and social democracy, Grossman insisted that the struggle of the working class over its day-to-day demands is necessarily bound up with its struggle for the final goal. The final goal for which the working class struggles is not therefore some ideal that is brought to the workers' movement from outside in a speculative manner, whose realization is reserved for some distant future, quite independently of the struggles that occur in the present. It is, on the contrary, a result that flows from immediate day-to-day struggles, and whose realization is accelerated by these struggles. By contrast, for the likes of Hilferding, capitalism itself tended to socialism in its present form, without revolution, without the institution of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the only context within which the revolutionary promise of the breakdown of capitalism can be realized. As Grossman put it, for such revisionists, if it's a matter of a regulated economy, then it ceases to be a capitalist economy. If it's capitalist, then it can't be regulated. The only problem with the capitalist economy of the imperialist epoch, then, is that the profits arising from production are appropriated by capitalists. The issue is simply one of abandoning private property for them so as to seize the existing productive apparatus. Such theories Grossman dubs as neo-harmonist, as having their origins in the anti-Marxist or revisionist thought of legal Marxist Ukrainian intellectual Mikhail Tugan-Baranovsky. Capitalist production is no longer conceived as a process of valorization, but simply as a sphere determined by technical requirements for the production of wealth. But the breakdown tendency of capitalism is chiefly a breakdown of the valorization process on the basis of the process of value creation, the law of value. What collapses is a form of distribution that is purely transitory and peculiar to a specific mode of production. But the tendency of capitalism to capitalism to crisis demonstrates the true possibility of its breakdown, the possibility of socialism itself. Only when the breakdown of capitalism is, so to speak, actively prosecuted under the dictatorship of the proletariat, rather than merely succumb to as yet another crisis, does it realize itself in socialism. Sorry.
I hope you stand by that.
I stand by that.
Not yet.
Oh, there I am. Oh, I'm really loud. I'm glad that Danny stands by it too. I have two questions. So one addresses the beginning of the presentation on the question of crisis and the idea of like a theory of economic crisis. And the kind of obsession the millennials had with a theory of economic crisis, which I think in the context of the weirdness of the Biden years, it seems to have a kind of ghostly afterlife that's sanctioned by the repression of change that has happened for the last 3 years. And it reminded me of Benjamin Studebaker's comments last night about Lenin, which he regarded as really being about a theory of crisis. He said that there was kind of a demand for a new theory of crisis. And so I just wondered, why is it that there seems to be a kind of recurrent demand for a theory of crisis, and how, you kind of addressed it at the end, but I would like you to specify it more, how that is different from, but also related to the crisis of Marxism and the way that Marxism would have dealt with crisis and breakdown. And then my second question is about kind of the second half, and specifically when you're talking about Grossman. So you said that Grossman argues that the economic side of the revisionist dispute has been at least partially ignored in favor of the political side of the dispute. What is meant by the economic side versus the political side of the revisionist dispute? So for example, last night in my remarks about Lenin, I tried to talk about the state and revolution and then imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and the relationship between the question of revolution in the state and the organizational question, and how the question of the organization of the proletariat is also, for Lenin, part of the revisionist dispute that needs to be prosecuted through the split in the working class, which is the precondition for revolution. It seems to me that that could be considered quote-unquote economic, as in there's kind of an economic character to the attempt to prosecute the revisionist dispute by Lenin and Luxemburg. What does he mean by there has not been an emphasis on the economic side, or what would constitute the economic side of the revisionist dispute for Grossman?
You want to start with the...
I'll start, and you can
please.
speak at the pause in terms of talking. So, in terms of the first thing, I mean, so a few things come to mind. So Platypus published an article in 2008 by James Hartfield called Living Marxism, and I always recommend it for newer members, because he talks about how parts of capital, like the so-called falling rate of profit kind of obsession, were not there in, say, the New Left or in the 80s, having to do with the politics then. And writing at the time of the financial crisis, all of a sudden, every Marxist decided they were orthodox and held to this all of a sudden. And I bring that up because now a lot of millennials have experienced all sorts of ups and downs, maybe multiple crashes. I think I saw a meme about this. And I feel like the turn towards that kind of so-called theory of crisis, and I'm going to compare it to what Studebaker said as Lenin's theory of crisis, has been a way of reaching for Marxism as almost this is going to sound maybe pessimistic, but a form of adaptation to what explains why we can't have good things. There's this, Marx has said why our lives are miserable because there's some kind of falling rate of profit, and this is why everything crashes, and despite the greed of Wall Street, it's going to tumble down upon them. I was thinking when you mentioned Studebaker, so Lenin famously at the Second Congress says there's no such thing as final crises, we have to make it the final crises. And in a lot of ways, I think this is what Spencer was getting at. Really, if you read Grossman, Grossman would not say 2008 or 1973 or any of these things that Grossman is usually reached for are a breakdown of capitalism at all. That's in a lot of ways the almost distorted misreading, right, that kind of stood out to me. This has been my first time reading Grossman, that actually he says, well, the rate of profit really doesn't tell you anything at all. Even though I hear this every 5 seconds that this is like his thing. Is 6% good, is 1% good? And as Spencer was saying at the end, this imperfect valorization, it's really about the incongruity of bourgeois social relations to socialized production. And that's the thing, that's the kind of morning sickness that's there in the accumulation. And so to make the breakdown of capitalism, the reason it's socialism is because it's overcoming bourgeois society. Like, that's the breakdown of capitalism. And it's in a sense simply intimated at in terms of the contradictory character of capitalist accumulation. So that was the kind of first thing. In terms of the second thing, I think, whenever I know back in Philly right now, they're reading Reform or Revolution. I'm going to miss it because it's tomorrow night. I'm going to be on a plane. But of course, people love the opening chapters of Reform or Revolution because they believe they're like economic, right? The adaptation of capitalism, and it's like credit, and Rosa Luxemburg's going to show credit will not save you, blah, blah, blah. And so I think people think that's what's meant by the economics that shows up in the Revisionist Dispute. For Grossman, and Spencer mentioned this, the critique of my hero, Rosa Luxemburg, which sometimes I'm gritting when I read it, but I'm trying to treat this seriously. It's to the degree that he really wants something as imminent as possible to even Marxist political economy. It's even a critique of so-called Marxist political economy, meaning, I don't know if you mentioned this in passing, but in a lot of ways, Grossman is trying to pursue the line of thought that Rosa Luxemburg was doing in the Accumulation of Capital, when she's saying the opportunism in the Marxist movement is actually reproducing earlier debates from the 19th century between like Ricardo and Sismondi, or say that Otto Bauer, or I might mispronounce his name, Tugan Barnowski, is reproducing these kind of harmonies, but they're actually reproducing them through Marx's own Capital. So if you're a total nerd and you've like gotten to the end of volume 2 and you know there's like these schemas between department 1 or 2, they were basically reading that as, well, Marx has at least shown what could be possible to have a kind of infinite accumulation of capitalism, right? Because he's given the kind of mathematical descriptions. Grossman's issue with that ultimately, even though he's on Rosa Luxemburg's side, is he feels that Rosa Luxemburg ultimately gives, in his view, a kind of external explanation for what they're kind of leaving out or adapting to.
I mean, Lenin also criticized accumulation of capital with the criticism reason.
Yes, and actually, so Lenin had a note, yeah, he was going to write this critique of the accumulation of capital, the total nerd. It's in like one of the collected works where he has his conspectus and goes, how could Frau Luxemburg say this? Or he accuses her of plagiarism even. He's like, she's cribbing from Development of Capitalism. But, you know, that whatever, that was the period when they obviously had a lot of respect for each other later. Luxemburg is our eagle. But the point is, for me, in the revisionist dispute, to the degree that socialism has to take responsibility for the world, the things that Grossman tends to later find as external, these external explanations, are really bound up with the way in which the contradictions of the movement were presenting themselves were things like the growth of imperialism. So Rosa Luxemburg will say, well, what's concomitant with the growth of unions? Navalism and militarism and the growth of colonies, whereas that seems to be inadequate in the 20s, especially once you have a Comintern, a communist movement in an ostensible socialist country, that now it's one of these things where Grossman in a lot of ways, and this is why he's similar to Lukács and Korsch, is really giving a critique of the other Marxists, Bukharin, for example, and saying, no, what we need is actually how there's not even Marxist economics. And in fact, he's going to prove that by saying Marx's method was always one where whenever he seems to give you a formula or a formulation, it's actually inadequate. It's a kind of way in which Grossman has you were describing this earlier as an exoteric way of talking about the dialectic, that whenever you think Marx is giving you his economics, actually he shows it to be one-sided. And he calls it the method of successive approximations. Okay, it sounds Newtonian if you've been in a physics class, but you know, it's his way of talking about the dialectic that he feels the Marxists were violating and kind of accommodating. So maybe if Dr. Leonard wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, maybe just to speak a little bit in a slightly more elementary way. I mean, there isn't the critique of political economy's like value or use is like really unclear, actually, in a number of ways. It's politically very unclear because already you guys might remember from the class struggles in France, Marx says, oh, the revolution is like winding down now. But its return is just as sure as the next economic crisis. Later, he backs off of any kind of clear political relationship between economic crisis and revolution. Right? This is not like, you can't like gaze into the seeds of time like by understanding Marx's Capital and like, it's not really going to help you to like strategically orient towards a revolutionary situation. It's a very esoteric question of what this body of material is about. And in a sense, I would say Grossman is deeply sympathetic to Lukács, right? Because Lukács basically prosecutes an entire argument about negative dialectics through a reading of Capital. Right? The vast majority of Lukács's references are to Capital, right? Especially in, say, the reification essay. So, you know, and you'll hear Chris say this all the time, right? Marx is a bit of like a maniac. Right? He is a maniac, and there is an immense amount to learn from the reading of the Critique of Political Economy, and it is hard to specify what that is, right? I would say that Grossman is, what he's saying, why he loves Rosa Luxemburg in Reform and Revolution, right? That's his teacher. And he, as a young person, he would, he smuggled copies of this stuff, into to Austria, into Galicia. He was a student of Rosa Luxemburg's politically and intellectually. I think that, by the way, is a very good way of thinking about the Frankfurt School, right? To understand that the devotees of Rosa Luxemburg in Germany are in the Frankfurt School, that they're mediated through Lukács, which of course is very much preoccupied with Rosa Luxemburg, especially in history and class consciousness. Of course, with Lenin as well. He thinks that the insights that she has in Reform and Revolution about how the crisis how the new economic forms that are being thrown up in terms of large-scale corporations, trusts and monopolies, new credit forms, et cetera, that her argument about how these are deepening the contradictions within capitalism are not fully realized in the accumulation of capital, and that instead she's too guided, in effect, by the phenomenal expressions of political crisis leading up to World War I, which looked like colonial crises, right? So she talks about the significance of colonial markets, of kind of external markets to capitalism, as necessary to absorb capital investment, et cetera. Danny can explain this better than I can, in terms of the actual economic dimensions of the accumulation of capital. Please.
Well, I was going to just say an essay that he writes earlier, so it's kind of in Spencer's narrative of, like, Grossman really doesn't write about Das Kapital at all, that I know of, really. He does a lot of kind of activism regarding Jewish workers. He's a minor figure in...
Before the war.
Before the war, yeah.
Right.
And it's really something that's happening, like, when we started to read this, it really is reflecting that Third International moment where a lot of people were inspired to look back at, like, Marxism and rediscover Marxism. And even...
The change in Grossman intellectually is as dramatic as Lukács going from a bourgeois, bohemian avant-garde intellectual to becoming a Marxist.
Right.
His Marxism is totally transformed.
Right. And so for me, those early essays, I don't know, about the economic system of Karl Marx, I think that's what the title is, the 1923 one. But one that I've brought up a lot, an article he writes about a petty bourgeois economist, Sismondi, right, who is usually known as kind of a figure that Marx and later Rosa Luxemburg would say, here's the archetypical example, not even Proudhon, Sismondi, of a person who they would say blames capitalism on distribution as opposed to production, right? This is like the standard thing that Sismondi says, well, people are underpaid and that's why we have economic crises. He writes this very lengthy essay in 1924, and I recommend people to read it as well.
Sismondi, who's influencing all the utopian socialists.
All the utopian socialists. And he basically shows through this essay, and he even says at one time, well, maybe you can find counterexamples. But the point is that he can do this, where he just seems to show that Sismondi said everything that's associated with Marx. That he already had a falling rate of profit, that he already talked about value is inadequate to socialized production, that value is being destroyed. All of these things that people usually learn from, like, oh, did you know this? It's the crisis of value and value critique. Grossman reads it out of Sismondi. And then in the final few paragraphs he says, and so what's missing with Sismondi? Well, the class struggle had not appeared, right? In other words, the workers had not organized themselves into a class. And so nonetheless, in the final instance, he's kept at a kind of what would look like a utopian socialist level. And I bring that up because, of course, in the context of him writing this, he's writing this in the middle of the early Third International to these people who are becoming Marxists. And in a sense saying, look, the only thing that made Marx Marx is that the critique of political economy is about the proletarian socialist movement. And that if you reduce it to a theory of economic crises, then you're no better than Sismondi, and worse because it was better the first time, right? And of course, this is how Grossman is taken today, by the way. So, you know, I would recommend that essay for him. So this is why he kind of sets himself this program that comes like the brilliance of the spirit of Marx coming back to him. But that's all I wanted to mention about that part.
The fundamental issue about the breakdown tendency of capitalism is that we tend to think, I mean, this is totally widespread on the left today, that people think that reforms are things that the left demanded, right? Which isn't really a Marxist concept of reform. Concept of reform is more like what is happening in the state and in society in the face of socialism, right? And that's not just like welfare programs or something like that. That's things like the development of monopolies and trusts. That's things like the expansion of credit facilities. That's all the ways in which capitalism is trying to meet the social crisis. That is in fact a kind of ongoing response to the emergence of socialism and the development of socialism, the social question. And the theory of breakdown is, of course, on the one hand, that there is that capitalism is crisis, is breakdown, right? That it is social disintegration, right? And a democratically mediated, but understanding democracy far beyond the mere question of party and the struggle for state power, you know, democracy at the level of society as a whole, generating all kinds of economic changes. So it's a theory of the negativity in society itself, right? That society is disintegrating in and through its reproduction, right? And that a phenomenal, that we think about that when, like, the economy breaks down. Like the whole of society has to register that phenomenon, right? That in that sense, the necessity for socialism for the whole of society, not for the working class alone, is registered in crises which are kind of aborted and patched together breakdowns. And the goal of Marxists is to give the fullest scope to the negative potential of capitalism to break down, right? To allow the breakdown of capitalism to be prosecuted politically.
Right. We reject the breakdown.
Right. Whereas the millennial response is the recoil from the negativity of capital, from the disintegrative potentials of capital. Right? And that's because of the incomprehensibility of mastering it. Right? The kind of dread that is produced at the kind of preconscious, by the preconscious suppression of the recognition of socialism.
Hello? Yeah. Actually, I think your last comment was to some extent already an answer to my first question, at least. I wanted to ask you to maybe still say a bit more about how this reading of Grossman speaks against the falsifications of the Frankfurt School. And as you now laid out, I think the answer would be that he makes clear that there is this understanding of capital as a negative dialectic, as this disintegration of society, as this expression of negativity within society, which can be taken for granted by people like Adorno and Horkheimer, because they read Grossman, and they know their Marxism also through his lens. So it's not a new discovery of somebody like Moïse Postone, and these readers who would claim, well, this value crisis, this deep dimension of crisis is something that had been neglected by these authors, but yeah, well, it was clear because Grossman wrote about it. So that's what I took now from that from your talk and this answer. So maybe the second part of the question would be, or maybe there's more to be said about this, like because you said you want to address also the falsification of the Frankfurt School through addressing the work of Grossman, and maybe there are some other aspects that are important in this respect. But the second part of my question would be like, could you say maybe a bit more about the differences or why they would be parting at some point? You said because Grossman himself changed his position. One thing that came to my mind when listening to your talk and emphasizing the economic dimension of the revisionist dispute might be, let's say, a neglect maybe of Bonapartism and the authoritarian state. And maybe that would be a question, like, is that something that Grossman is also dealing with? Is he attributing importance to, let's say, this dimension of the disintegration of capitalist society and the product of class struggle being actually these kind of obstacles produced as well? Or might that be a moment where Grossman and the people from the Institute part ways also?
I just will say two things to lead into that. So in his correspondence with like Paul Maddock, he does comment upon when, with the Nazi seizure of power, that he feels like the KPD, I know it's probably pronounced differently, is ceasing to learn. And he actually starts to say to Paul Maddock, can you send me those Trotsky essays? Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, he's feeling something being lost. And that wasn't the case, meaning in the 50 years of the struggle for Marxism, he very much sides, I'll just say with the Comintern, not necessarily Stalin's side, but let's say Trotsky was wrong. He considers it, what does he call it, hyper-industrialization? Something like that. But he starts to kind of lose his bearings, and this is why I had this letter open from 1935. This is actually to Max Horkheimer and Pollock, and it kind of reflects something, a little bit of, I don't know, some sadness or melancholia to it. And maybe this gives a characterization of how he is at the time. He goes, ultimately, we all fight for the great proletarian cause. But as a result of the disruption of the workers' movement, there is no longer any possibility of the satisfaction every fighter previously, before World War, he's talking about the Second International, had of acknowledgement from within the movement. So one is therefore happy that one can find satisfaction within the narrower circles in which one is involved and has the incentive to work on from this. And from a letter, let's see, this would be just a week prior to Max Horkheimer, he talks about over there, he's talking about Moscow, Stalin must be praised as the greatest philosopher, greatest economist, greatest thinker ever. So I bring this up because he seems to run up against some kind of wall upon which he feels like he can be effective as a thinker. And I think this is around the time that he's starting to break or break up his correspondence with Horkheimer and Pollock, and also about the time that they're changing towards a kind of change of position. I mean, a few years later would be the state capitalism thesis, by which he, I imagine, probably already had conversations with Pollock before then, of course. So I would just add those two things.
Right. So I think what Danny's picking up on is the Frankfurt School is, its politics are very tricky. right? Like, what does Horkheimer think about, third period Stalinism, right? Or what do they think about the Popular Front, right? You can't really trace it, I would argue. There's nobody who, you can see their sympathies, right? But there is especially under Horkheimer, right? So I think someone recently, maybe it was on the list, I can't remember where it was, where people were, I guess it was on the list. They were circulating a letter from, is it Adorno to Horkheimer, where he's like reading, no, I think it's from Adorno to Horkheimer, and he's like reading Trotsky, and he's saying, I know we normally ignore this stuff, but this is really interesting, right? Because I think that in the criticizing Trotsky on like his industrial program against his Stalin and his other antagonists within the Bolshevik Party. Is that the fundamental issue between Trotsky and Stalin? No, right? So what are the fundamental issues, right? I think what you see in the early Frankfurt School is an immense ideological openness under Grunberg, up to the point of a kind of a total breakdown of any ability of the SPD and the communists to work together in the third period, right? Which I think puts an immense amount of pressure on the kind of environment of the Frankfurt School. Someone like Horkheimer is trying to maintain as a kind of maximal openness until the Nazi seizure of power. At which point, like a recognition of the total defeat of the political project comes to, I think, occupy his vision centrally, right? And this is where, like, some of what I was saying about the revisionist dispute becomes really significant, right? Like, what is are the Frankfurt School prosecuting the revisionist dispute? Tricky, very tricky, right? Unrecognizable, because there's no context for it, right? I would argue on one hand they are, right? I would argue on the one hand they are preserving orthodoxy. On the other hand, they're preserving orthodoxy outside the only framework, and this gets somewhat to Aaron's point about organizational form, within which that even makes any sense. And so there's a question, I would say that Horkheimer's essays, and for instance, the whole project of negative dialectics, of what becomes the dialectic of enlightenment, like the joint Horkheimer and student project, right? Initially, he thinks he's going to write that book with Marcuse, and then he goes to write it with Adorno. That project starts to take shape. By the time of the Popular Front, it's like we're not even really trying to resist fascism, right? The Popular Front, of course, is in the name of anti-fascism, but it's really a capitulation to it, right? And I think at that point, like any historian of the Frankfurt School can tell you this, right? Traditional and critical theory is like the essay that anyone will point to say, this is the open door to the Horkheimer and Adorno of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, what Adorno will eventually continue. Where the project becomes explicitly to theorize what are the grounds of possibility for the perpetuation or the upholding of Marxism when the struggle for socialism is entirely consigned to oblivion from in any discernible way. Right? There's absolutely no way to discern a struggle for socialism anymore. Right? That this isn't, we're not experiencing some sort of temporary defeat, we're experiencing a whole-scale collapse of a world historic movement. That's what I meant by saying, like, the Frankfurt School is a vision and a structure of collaboration, right? At that point, right, that's really what we mean, right? When Platypus says, like, the Frankfurt School and Trotsky, right? We mean, like, what does it mean to think Marxism after the struggle for socialism, right? It's precisely there where I would say that Grossman starts to kind of crack up, right? And he does so for a lot of reasons. He does so because, like, for instance, and Horkheimer doesn't really, they're very different, and they're the one man is older than the other, and Grossman was, as I say, he was a revolutionary in the pre-war period. He was a political man, more political than Horkheimer and Adorno had ever been. He was a veteran. He knew Rosa Luxemburg, and his work was highly respected. And their correspondence is very respectful, right, in general. It's not like super collaborative, but as the passage that Danny was just reading, I mean, he's basically saying, well, we used to have the whole movement to, like, give us a kind of sense of value, right, or of the worth of what we're doing. The only substitute I have for that is you guys, right? Is you, Horkheimer and Adorno. He loves the fucking Frankfurt School, right? Like, he's a Marxist. But when he gets into arguments with them over politics, right? And he thinks, like, for instance, I think Horkheimer describes Grossman trying to defend the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And obviously Horkheimer, and I think Löwenthal is there, and Pollock, they're saying, like, this, like, it's over, right? It's over. This isn't our movement anymore. This is like the new czar in Russia. He's making a pact with the emperor of the Germans. It's all barbaric, right? And Grossman is saying we have to defend Stalin, right? So he's kind of retreating to communism, and there are theoretical dimensions to that. So but what I would say is, even to the end, Horkheimer, they were not going to break over politics, right? I would say that the Frankfurt School don't break over politics, and because they don't agree over politics. That's why Horkheimer's best friend at that point, is like, maybe we could talk about Trotsky sometime. It's kind of cool, right? Like, they're obviously, like, not dealing, with, like, Marxism at that level, because they think our entire collaboration is going to break down over that, and we're not going to preserve Marxism in that way, right? We're going to preserve Marxism in some other way, and they're beginning to think about what Adorno will call, like, a message in a bottle, right? What I'm calling a kind of vision and structure of collaboration. Yeah.
Comment on this, which is that, so a few things. I mean, one, obviously, I always get the impression later, in the few times when they comment on Grossman, that there is a feeling of tragedy. In other words, like, Grossman obviously is brilliant, and in his letters to Paul Maddock, he's like, oh, I changed Pollock's mind about Rosa Luxemburg. Like, he's enough of a person that he could change a brilliant person like Pollock's mind over, it's about Luxemburg and gold and accumulation, you don't have to read it. Okay, so, but...
He's brilliant enough to recognize brilliance in others.
Brilliance in others. But there is a change also in the kinds of things that he writes in, say, 1941. Right, so this is like Marx and the problem of dynamics and the evolutionist revolt, right? where
This is the point. This is what they actually break over.
this is what they start to break over. And you might know the Horkheimer letter where he writes to him, and they're talking about
It's been
Hegel.
circulated on the list.
It's been circulating. It's a great letter, a short letter as well. But I bring that up because, in a sense, in the problems of dynamics, Grossman is doing something that I imagine in his mind is, well, what would Marx do today? Oh, he would critique Friedrich Hayek. These are the kinds of people that he starts to critique. Hayek, and he's going to critique the utility theorist. And you can even feel in the essay, and especially even where it was published in a major American economics journal, that it's no longer really the critique of political economy. It's like kind of Marxist economics.
It's warped by the Popular Front. It's like fight the right,
Yeah.
and it's becoming progressive.
It's becoming progressive, and in terms of even something like, so the evolutionist revolt, where Horkheimer says, and it's
He's naming essays.
I'm naming essays, everybody, that in volume 1. The point is that kind of the point of what Marx was doing starts to kind of drop out. And there might be very interesting things in the essays. I feel like I've learned from them, of course.
Of course.
But you can just see that it just starts to be kind of Marxology and not really being able to maintain the critical standpoint. And I would say as well, what is the Frankfurt School accused of? Oh, they've given up on materialism and economics for culture. And, we had the opportunity to read something like The Dialectic of Enlightenment or The Eclipse of Reason, where, in a lot of ways, they're no longer giving a critique of, say, the socialist movement, but they are critiquing, say, the outcome of the failure of socialism, right? So you think in aesthetic theory, like Adorno, the shudder, that can people still hear the echo of the missed revolution in the culture industry, of how it was supposed to be the promise of, America, and yet we can recognize how our aesthetic desires are preformed in an unfree manner. Things like that, which is that, can you maintain the necessity? And that would be, I think, where they feel that Grossman cannot hold on. Now, I'll just say one thing.
Right, so just to be
Yeah.
to maybe answer your question again in a slightly more plain pedagogical way, right? I compared it like Lukács. I compared Grossman's relationship to Luxemburg to Lukács' critique of Engels. What is that about? Lukács criticizes Engels for sometimes falling below Engels' own best insights. Engels is a master of Marxist dialectics, right, unmistakably, in the Holy Family, in the German Ideology, in the Communist Manifesto, and in the books that Friedrich Engels writes on his own. Nevertheless, he's got some clunkers, right? Especially as, for Lukács' purposes, those formulations have become unserviceable. The Frankfurt School breaks with Grossman to preserve Grossman's insights, right? For them, it's Grossman who's abandoned Grossman, right? This is how they learn from everybody, right? This is how they treat everyone. But Grossman had been a close comrade, right? And so I would put it like that they view him as a very late and heroic expression of what happens to fucking everybody in the 1930s. Which is that their minds are warped by Stalin.
I'm going to add an example which many of you might be familiar with. It was on one of our syllabuses a few summers ago. The Philosophical Elements of a Theory of Society, I think that's the title, where Adorno says...
Adorno's lectures.
Adorno's lectures, where Adorno says, my old teacher, Henryk Grossman. Right? In other words, he says, oh, Henryk Grossman taught me capital, and he makes reference to a certain formulation by Grossman. Right, he calls it the method of successive approximations. And in a sense, both while allowing for perhaps a critique of certain things of Grossman, is actually saying it's a brilliant kind of, you're just putting it as exoteric insight into a way of thinking about capital and negative dialectics, meaning he kind of runs with it. And so he's saying right there, yes, I've learned an enormous amount from this person, nonetheless, yeah.
Right, so when Aaron and and Danny did their teach-in on capital, they were basically talking about method, right? When you read the whole motherfucking thing, right? When you read whatever 2,500 pages, you're left with a vast thought of the phenomenology of capital, right? What does spirit look like in self-contradiction, right? What does bourgeois society look like under conditions of capital? What is the relationship of the things you think are society, like prices, your negotiation with your boss, what you think our struggle is about, right? The price of food at the grocery store, how much I earn, how long I had to work, right? To the underlying dynamics of what Marx calls capitalist accumulation, right? That is not exactly going, like, you can characterize that in a lot of ways. Grossman puts it in, I would say, a relatively teacherly way or exoteric way, whereas when you read Lukács, it's, you know, he's trying to explicate kind of the underlying, like, suppositions of that method, right, of how Marx goes from, like, consider the commodity, right, to, like, the world market by the end of volume 3.
You know, that was our first argument, me and Danny.
Uh-huh.
The first argument we got into was about whether or not when Danny was stocking groceries at the grocery store, he was creating value.
And look how far he's come.
Yeah, I know.
And what that ended up, no, but what that ended up posing to us was this question of, well, okay, actually, is this a kind of descriptive argument about what constitutes, is this a descriptive, I can yell pretty well, is this a descriptive argument about what constitutes value, or is it rather an intervention in the problems and questions of political economy that are being posed by the organization of the working class, namely, what counts as value from the standpoint of society and from the standpoint of a society in crisis? And I think that is like a good, like, because we were kind of getting at Grossman, like when you explain Grossman, Danny, it sounds like a lot of our conversations, but that's sort of like confusion of the phenomenology that then gives way to like a deeper historical and political problem, which seemed to us to really connect Das Kapital and Marx to Lenin and to Rosa Luxemburg and to kind of the self-criticism of the workers' movement. Anyway, sorry.
No, you know, whenever Grossman critiques people on readings of Das Kapital, 9 times out of 10, they're like, well, that's what he says in that chapter. But you got to keep reading to the next chapter, and then you realize, no, that's how it appeared, and now it's upside down, and now it's going more concretely, and now actually that's contradictory, and you realize you were led by the nose, and that you thought you were deducing this, but actually capital was presented in some way. Meaning it's always a question of him returning to Marx on everything. It's really not like a economics argument.
Right,
So
I mean,
it was
really
good,
Marx will never resolve the question of whether, like, stacking groceries, right, are you in the sphere of
I was not
circulation, or are
producing
you in the
value.
sphere of
Like,
production?
it was not productive
Right.
what I was doing.
Right,
Yeah.
ultimately for Marx, like those kinds of, like who is a worker, like all the shit you hear, like podcast people go on and on about, right, they get very hot and bothered about these questions, like if you work in this sector of the economy, you are a worker, but if you work in that sector of the economy, you aren't. And these sort, and Marx will actually toy with you in like volume 2, where he's like talking about like transportation and working in retail and like blah, blah, blah. Like sometimes he'll say, you know, an opera singer is producing value, and another time he'll say, but there's, because it operates on many different phenomenological, many levels of society, and in fact, the appearance of society contradicts the underlying dynamics in innumerable ways. But the crucial point that I guess I should make is that those questions are also political, right? Like, what is the working class is a political question, right? I mean, I will sometimes, put it to students when I'm trying to simplify it. I'll say the working class is the organized working class, right? What is a peasant? It's an unorganizable person, right? Like how do you understand these things, right? What is right? They're workers. They don't own the means of production, but they're not workers. Why? Because they can't join they can't join the working class movement for socialism in any sense, right? So, Marx integrates these things into the structure of his understanding of society, right? So that the movement for socialism is integral to this self-contradiction of capital accumulation, actually. Right? He addresses it directly in the chapter on the working day, but it really runs through the whole of 3 volumes. And it's a very complicated, and he's not trying to resolve it or help you particularly, right? He's trying to get you to think about what is politics in this like fetishistic world of democracy, right? Of socialism operating within this world of like issues and questions and how the worker struggle appears in the newspaper and how it appears in the policy changes of the state and even the policy changes of like the Chamber of Commerce and the rules of the stock market, et cetera.
Okay. Oh, nice. Okay. It was like sitting in my hand the whole time and not making noise. So I guess, yeah, I apologize if this is not entirely coherent. I'm just stringing thoughts together. Well, I guess this is a question about both like Grossman's eventual Stalinism, as you talk about it, and also I guess like how to even think about political economy or the critique of political economy after the failure of the revolution. Because I was actually really surprised when I saw that this teaching was going to be about Henryk Grossman, because like my immediate, usually when I see Henryk Grossman, the name show up, like immediately like alarm bells go off in my head. And it's like I'm reminded of, for example, like talking to like a mug guy who liked Henryk Grossman, and he's like one of these guys where it's like, like Platypus, they like, they're flawed because like they don't care about political economy. They don't care about like having, like a materialist, Marxist, like economic, like view of the world. And like he liked Henryk Grossman because it was like, this is the guy that gives you like the real positive, like Marxist, materialist, like economics, right? And so that's kind of like, and I'm not sure which work he was talking about specifically. I think like, I remember going and reading some Grossman after that, and I think it was probably from the 30s or maybe something like that, because it did, I mean, I should have prepared for this more, but it did feel somewhat like that when I read that Grossman. And so I guess, sorry. I guess because the larger question it brings up is like, I mean, it's like also like, why are people motivated to read Grossman today? But I think the larger question is sort of like you guys were talking about, like, what is like the status of the critique of political economy and like, like Marxists after Marx? Or like, for example, this guy from Mug is the sort of person who would disagree with like a kind of Platypus claim that, like, Das Kapital is like there, it's not like a positive economic theory, it's a critique, it's there because, the workers' movement for socialism is taking up, like Adam Smith and Ricardo. So in that sense, like what is Grossman doing if he's writing this in like the 20s and he's writing a critique of, say, like Luxembourg or talking about capital, but like, in the mid or late 20s, and like, I don't know, it's like, how does this relate to like the politics of the time? Is this what people are like talking about then, or like how, I don't know, I guess like my main question, I guess, was like, what is the position of like political economy or the critique of political economy after the failure of the revolution? And maybe if that ties into Stalinism or like the evolution of his thought.
I mean, I guess I would just say, and Dan, jump right in, that Yeah, I guess I would ask, what he thinks he gets from Marx, and to ponder for a minute the perversity of it all, right? And what I mean by the perversity of it all is, why on earth has nobody written anything better than Karl Marx's Capital for 150 years, right? Like, what kind of worldview does this mug person have if we have this ongoing problem of, like, political economy, and it's just a theory of the economy, and yet our immense scientific university society, with monumental universities and everything else, just has no successor to Karl Marx, and all of these things that pass as economics are somehow irrelevant, right? Like, it's a very strange thing to pick up Marx's Capital, right? And to think it's going to tell you something about the world today, right? It's downright madness, in fact, to think this, right? Like, seriously. If he thinks I'm going to get some kind of, like, I'm going to be able to debate something in the DSA about how we should relate to the Democrats on the basis of reading this book that was written 155 years ago. I mean, seriously, right? And why I kept on emphasizing that Grossman is addressing Marx in the way that he thinks necessary. It's very different from, like, a Postone, right? Postone thinks you just go back to Marx, right? You just jump right over the history of Marxism, and you have Marx, and you have the social theory there, right? Grossman knows this book comes to us through Marxism, right? Its relevance is within Marxism. We have to ask ourselves, what is this critique of socialism to us now, right? And it occurs, and there is a living debate within Marxism, and so what is the highest expression of that debate? It's Rosa Luxemburg. You pick up Rosa Luxemburg, it's fucking mind-blowing, right? It's a really great book, right? It's a really great book, and he's a great critic of a really great book. So for him, right, he's understanding, as it were, that it's a question of the renewal of Marxism under changed conditions, which means a return to Marx, but also via the contemporary debates over that have generated this history of symptoms, right, since then. And so I guess, I would say that to this mug person, right? Like, okay, Marx is like, da-da-da-da-da, and this is why Sir Dudley North, like, is, absolutely right in 1690. Like, what is this lunacy? Right? You've read why is Marx, like, have 1,000 little footnotes where he's, telling you this is how this insight emerged in 1719 in this obscure anonymous pamphlet written in English, which was about, like, an East India Company debate. Marx, like I say, he's a maniac, right? He's a maniac. And he's telling you the whole history of the emergence of bourgeois society and its crisis through this thing called political economy, right? He's writing his history of modern bourgeois ideology through this, right? His insights about Descartes are to be understood through what he's saying about Sir William Petty. His understanding of Kant is best understood through what he's saying about Adam Smith. The best thing that Marx ever said about Hegel is when he isn't talking about Hegel at all. Right. It's in the Critique of Political Economy, right? Now, so I would just push this young man, young woman to tell me what he thinks this has to do with a world in which the entire presupposed object doesn't exist, namely the workers' movement for socialism as heir to bourgeois revolution.
If I can just add, we all know the famous phrase, philosophy continues to exist because its moment for realization was missed. Like, we know this from negative dialectics. So Rosa Luxemburg has an essay, What is Economics? And she just says, the abolition of the proletariat will mean the abolition of economics. right? Like, in other words, the point is to fucking overcome it. It's not like, well, here's more economics, yay. And of course, the reason I brought up Grossman in the 40s is because this, to me, is an expression of the collapse of the critique of political economy that actually, he says plenty of brilliant things about the economists of his time. Like, people, people might not know if they're like Austrian school people, it'd be even contemporaries of like a Paul Samuelson, and it kind of just doesn't matter. And basically
And
what
it tosses off all kinds of insights on Sismondi and Jones and everyone else
right, like
on
that,
on the history of political economy.
which is why, to me, that's an expression of why it can't be maintained, because it's not like it's a bad essay from a scholarly perspective. It's just an echo to nobody, right? It kind of flies off to Jupiter. Because he basically ends the essay, under such circumstances, equilibrium, the rule presupposed by political economy, can only occur, as it were, by chance within the general irregularity as a momentary point of transition in the midst of constant disequilibrium. Meaning he's just saying all economics today is, in a sense, trying to hold together bourgeois society that's collapsing. And so, the only way in which one can actually follow through on what was the goal of political economy to become for itself and therefore overcome it altogether. Like, the point is not like, here's an expression of economics and then the proletariat's over here. The categories would become self-conscious and thus overcome, right? They're kind of basis, they would be transformed. That, what we kind of get today is just like an attempt to hold it together. And he's basically saying in this essay, all of economics is wrong, but the critique cannot land in the way that it could still in the 20s, let alone when Rosa Luxemburg or Marx is writing. So that, that to me is like the thing. I mean, I'd be like Spencer as well, of like, well, tell me what I'm apparently missing, because I'm like a polemical person and like to argue. But yeah.
Yeah, please.
No, thanks for that response. I guess maybe to put a point on it, maybe as a follow-up question, it's like in the 20s, for example, maybe even into the early 30s, but in like the 20s, how is the workers' movement for socialism taking up political economy, and how is Grossman like responding to that, or like a critique of that? That's
Right.
kind of my question.
So that's why we've kind of relayed him to Lukács and Korsch. Meaning they're taking it up because there's the question of the revolution. The October Revolution, maybe the failure of the German Revolution, meaning what does it mean for them to, maintain the perspective of global revolution?
I mean, the way that the workers' movement for socialism is taking up political economy is that it's waiting for an economic crisis or something like this. I mean, Grossman, eventually the Stalinists will just say that the Great Depression is the, final breakdown of capitalism, right? And that the Great Depression points towards world revolution. I don't know that Grossman ever endorses that. Right. The way that the critique of political economy is taken up in the workers' movement for socialism is that they are liquidating the Second International in World War I. Right? What does the disintegration of capitalism look like? It looks like war. And that war, part of the implications of Grossman's critique is, after the war, you can read Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital and believe that this war is just about colonial spoils. Right? The way that she treats the significance of the colonies and of the extra, sort of the world beyond capitalism as a source of raw materials and a place to kind of dump surplus production. You can imagine that, like any liberal, that the cause of World War I is about the struggle between Germany and the existing colonial powers for a share of colonial spoils, right? That is not the reason for World War I. That cannot explain World War I. first of all, it cannot explain what Rosa Luxemburg would call German war guilt, right? Which has to do really with the significance of socialism within Germany, right? And secondly, it can't explain the inability to end the war, right? How could like a struggle for like marginal advantages for a national economy justify a war that leaves entire national economies in ruins, right? What's driving this war is a much deeper political crisis, right, which is the true expression of capitalism and its disintegrative tendencies, right? It's, in other words, there is no direct way to the extent that there's a direct way that political economy is being expressed, it looks like supporting the state is going to hold up high wages and is going to help to preserve the party. And if we don't support the state, they're going to politically target the party and, blah, blah, blah. If we have a no strike pledge, right, it'll be basically full employment. It's like that, right? It's highly mediated through politics. There's an underlying reality, which is that the struggle for socialism is economic, right? This is why Marx writes a critique of political economy, right? To the working class, it is a struggle about your place in society, about whether you own the means of production or not. Right? That goes all the way back to the Chartists. Right? You can't be a Chartist if you're not a worker. Right? It's a working class politics. It's a division within the third estate. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to, to me, in other words, what would Grossman be saying? He's making I hate to put it like this, an economic argument for the necessity of the extension of the revolution ultimately. I mean, you obviously can't just build socialism in one country. In other words, what are you building? You're building on the basis of bourgeois social relations with industrial production. So in other words, the breakdown's not about like the United States, the capitalist countries. It's obviously about what's also being built in the Soviet Union.
Right. I mean, so he's talking about, what does it mean for a Marxist to, Marx said capitalism must break down. What is he saying? Right? The revisionists are like, that's terrible. I made this point in the paper. Because that's just telling us to all pack up our bags and go home. Right? Which is, in that sense, they've got the number of Ted Reese, right, and these millennials who think like, well, the whole thing's falling apart, right? So socialism's coming soon. Right, I mean,
capitalism is bad because it breaks down. Like, that's how it's posed. It breaks down, so instead we need something else.
Well, they become like, I hope we get there without World War III. Right, it's like this kind of shit, right? It's gonna be ugly between here and there, but on the other end is gonna be post-capitalism, right? It's a completely unpolitical reading of Marx. Right? Marx is trying to talk about, there's that wonderful bit at the end of the Law of Accumulation, where I think it's the end of the Law of Accumulation, where Marx says, and now the death knell of capitalism sounds, and the expropriators are expropriated, and et cetera. Right? The crisis of capitalism is here, right? And his point is that death knell of capitalism is sounding every minute, all the time. It's exploding our ears, right? Capitalism is disintegrating. The forms of property that it creates are being destroyed, right? The expropriators are being expropriated right now. That's how capitalism reproduces itself, right? It also points, so he can, in other words, it's a brilliant passage where Marx is simultaneously describing the achievement of socialism and of every minute under capitalism.
This is Mark. On the left in Germany, we're dealing with a lot of capital fetishism, pun intended. And I think part of the reason for that is that the political writings of Marx are sort of forgotten. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the New Left never really took up Marxist political writings. Yeah, except maybe for Hal Draper and the likes. And I was going to ask what you guys think about that. Why is that the case? And is it, is that a correct way of thinking, or like a helpful way of thinking about it?
I can't talk entirely to this domestic situation because other people might know more things about the relationship of, I imagine you were talking about Germany, like German New Left to the present millennial left. And so some of it might be outside of what I know. Millennial, speaking as a millennial, it's one of these things to me of, obviously Marx's critique has seemed to have purchase because of the what is the meme? Like, us millennials have lived through 3 economic crises and nobody has a house, and these are all true. I'm not making fun of these by any means. And so it seems like that's the thing to understand the world as it is. Certainly I was drawn to that as well. I feel like Grossman, so he has political writings. Grossman is absolutely familiar with all of Marx's political writings. Like, it's not, of course he is. Like, he can write about it. He's understanding what's happening in the 18th Brumaire. So in a lot of ways, he just takes it for granted. And so he doesn't have to, he in a sense can almost feels like he can write freely simply about the so-called economic issue and not have to remind people, this is about the dictatorship of the proletariat or about Lenin. Like, Lenin's experience seems to just have been embodied in the Third International such that everybody knows what he went through. I've talked about this in the past in teachings I've done at Das Kapital. I think it reflects the absence of the object of critique. And that's not even simply a millennial thing. I feel like when I've read Grossman, it starts to become occluded and opaque to him in his own lifetime, even. And that's why I was making reference to the 1941 article. And when Marx's critique of political economy, say comes back in the 60s, so Martin Nicolaus and Moshe Postone, it seems to be, I guess that's read as not, I don't know, and you would know them more personally. I guess when people read that, it doesn't seem to emphasize you sometimes have to ask people what they mean by breakdown, and I think they mean business cycles, right? They think a financial crash is what a breakdown is. And so I believe the Ted Rees book is like the final breakdown, meaning we've had a lot of business cycles, and this is going to be the fucking worst one, and it's the end, and it's Mad Max. And that's why I said early on, this is not what he means by breakdown. And that's, I think, the spirit behind what Spencer was saying, that actually the image of socialism is the breakdown of capitalism. And even, I'll say one thing more, the death knell, the chapter 32 ending, right? The expropriators are expropriated. That's one of these things as well, that if you think about what it would take to hear the death knell, just to run with the analogy, it presupposes the organization which makes it ring out in such a way such that one can recognize the possibility of the breakdown. Meaning the breakdown doesn't show itself in even the worst economic crises. That doesn't show shit. Of course not. There's no reason behind terrible things like that that would show socialism. It shows itself in something like, I'm thinking of, it's even crazy to read today, like Lenin saying, oh, you want to solve the economic crisis? A dictatorship of the proletariat. You need the peasants to overthrow the landlords and the workers to take control in the Soviets. That's going to not only solve the economic crisis, but it's going to take it to its full completion. So I feel like without that, even our concept of what a breakdown means has regressed to something that is totally in the realm of anything you could read on Bloomberg or the Financial Times or NBER, which is the American Bureau of Economic Research, where they have business cycles, right? Or long waves, people like this thing as well. So I would say, and I think this goes back to Aaron's question prior to this, is like, frequently I kind of ask people to sort of say what they mean by the economic crisis or whatever, the breakdown, and I feel like they just speak the spirit of the time. I've not been surprised yet in that context of what they believe to think Marx's object was, or what he's kind of showing. I don't know if you wanted to add.
Yeah, we were talking in the members meeting, maybe Stefan emphasized the point that, we are like the people that we're waiting for, in the sense that like we are tasked by these questions of our time and we are driven to master these things. But I would point out that I am like not entirely well suited to this project, right? Probably a lot of people in this room would be better suited to this project. It's a very German project. It's a very German project, and what you're talking about in terms of like the capital fetishism, right? And all of this preoccupation with the new Marx reading and with value theory and all of your journals, right? Most of which are defunct, but have been carrying on since the 70s and 80s. Right, there's an immense amount to say there, right? And I know, I'm an American leftist. I know Hal Draper, and I know that Hal Draper is a brilliant student of the political Marx, right? That's coming from his sectarian background in Shachtmanism. And I know what the rediscovery of Marxist capital looked like in America, which is why I helped put together that syllabus, a long time ago, talking to Chris, and we were looking at people like Martin Nicolaus and Moishe Pistone. But I think there are all kinds of, deep theoretical questions here, which I just indicated by saying, I know there's a reception of Grossman in Germany in 1969 and 70 and down through the 70s. I just don't know what it is. Right? There's a reason why these books get republished, right? So that said, Nicolaus, when he writes in 1968, says something that's a lot more productive, I think, than Pistone will, or a lot of these other people like Robert Kurtz or Michael Heinrich or all these others, right? Which is, he says, what would the Communist Manifesto look like written after Capital, right? We have the poverty of philosophy. We have like Marx's engagement with political economy and other writings like the economic and philosophic manuscripts. We have that, and then we have the Communist Manifesto. But then we have the critique of political economy, and all that we have is like this very weird, perverse thing, the critique of the Gotha program, right? Where again, like I get the sense of like, to me it's like the Moor or something, right? Like Marx the Moor, like this grumpy guy, right? He says like, okay, now I've written and I've saved my soul at the end of the critique of the Gotha program. Like, go your own fucking way. It's not an entirely politically responsible document, right? Which is why it's not published. And it's not a masterpiece like the Communist Manifesto is manifestly a masterpiece of Marx's, right? So what he's asking about there is the relationship of the critique of political economy to Marxist politics. That's what Nicolaus is raising, right? Yeah.
Right. So I did this Lenin teaching a few nights ago, and the reason I did this last February actually came out of discussions when we were talking about Grossman. A few years ago, I did an interview with Michael Roberts, and Michael Heinrich is mentioned in it because Michael Roberts and Michael Heinrich disagree. And I thought to myself, like a super nerdy, almost bibliography question, which was, when does Lenin talk about the falling rate of profit? Because Michael Roberts had this essay where he said, well, it wasn't really talked about that much in the Second International. Rosa Luxemburg has a footnote where she says, if you're waiting for the falling rate of profit to extinguish capitalism, you're going to wait for the sun to explode, right? In her anti-critique. And Lenin mentions it once, maybe. And to me, the impetus behind why I was kind of looking into certain things about Lenin is I was trying to figure out, okay, Lenin was a fucking great reader of Das Kapital, and in fact, he probably was one of the first early readers of Volume 3. I mean, as soon as he could get his hands on it, he's citing it in 1890s works, so probably just as it happened, he's kind of instantly grabbing it. And I just kind of thought, like, well, what did that text mean to him? And, you know, because I sort of felt like some of these later capital reading, or you were calling it the capital fetish, pun intended, they're really ways of trying to explain the failure of socialism. They're just trying to say, like, this failed because these people had an inadequate grasp of Das Kapital, and there's always this kind of, like, implicit, I think I asked Michael Roberts this in the interview, and he very, like, politely saved Lenin. Lenin was concerned with imperialism, and so that's what was on his mind at the time. But I really thought, like, no, of course, Lenin knows capital, of course, better than any of us will ever know it. And so I kind of, what set that teaching in motion was really a way of trying to prepare for this, of why is it that he had certain concerns about capital, that then Grossman is turning to these other things, you know, basically when Lenin is retired and then after his death. And that's why, for me, I always felt like, well, for Lenin, when he would talk about Das Kapital, he would talk about democracy. I think I mentioned this at the teach-in. He would say, you're a Philistine if you don't know that Das Kapital is about democracy.
These are the kinds of, and then I know Aaron's got a question. Yeah. These are the kind of debates I used to get into with Moishe Pistone, where he would tell, he was in effect saying that, well, Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin, I mean, he would say absurd things, like maybe they never read Capital, all right? Manifestly absurd things. And I, you know, of course, talking to Chris for many years about these things, you know, we were like, they knew how to read that book, right? They knew that you read that book and it absolutely, it impresses upon you the necessity of socialism. It orients you to politics in a profound way, in the sense that you think about like the phenomenal expressions of underlying social dynamics, but it has no direct purpose, right? Which is why they don't ever talk about it, right? They talk about it a little bit, yeah. Right? They talk about it a little bit, but they're engaged with dealing with a mass socialist movement of the working class. And the political writings are much more salient.
They're just fucking living it. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
They're just living it. That's why. Like, in other words, I have a book that's called Lenin's Economic Works. Don't buy it, because it's like, oh, I want to know when Lenin says the word capital. No. Everything he's talking about is out of Das Kapital. When he's saying, God damn it, Martov, why are you acting like this? It's about Das Kapital. Okay.
Oh, just because of the question, actually, one thing that I think can't go unsaid about Martin Nicolaus and Moishe Pistone, and particularly the two essays that we read in the reading group, and the way Pistone is then taken up by Werk Critique and these other sorts of people, is that in the readings that we have in the reading group, which are really like the highest critical self-consciousness of the New Left, right? What Nicolaus and Pistone are doing are diagnosing the obstacles to understanding Das Kapital. And that's why the Grundrisse is so important to them, because every sentence from the Grundrisse seems to just smash the dogmatic reading of Das Kapital. Right? There's a way that Das Kapital has been turned into a slogan. And everything about the Grundrisse, which is the notes for that book, just undermines that slogan completely. And part of the reason, and
if I can just say, Das Kapital becomes a Bible for Stalinism in the way that it was a Bible for revisionism. Right.
Yes, and speaking, specifically about Pistone, because I think he's had the greater influence today than Nicolaus. What happens, and I kind of saw this because I was in Pistone's last class before he died on Das Kapital, which had, grad students from all over the world who came to read Capital Volume 2 and 3 with him. And then he realized none of them had bothered to read Volume 1, so he yelled at all of us and then started lecturing Volume 1 for 10 weeks. But anyway, is that as an interpretation of Capital, which is what it's taken as, in fact, it cannot live up to its best insights at all. Because as an interpretation of Capital, it becomes like the argument against Engels and the argument against Marxist politics and the argument against the Second International and the argument against like Stalinism. And that just makes it confusing. Why? Because to make it that, it needs to be like an epistemology, right? And Moish would even say that in class. This is Capital is an epistemology, right? And there were mistakes about people didn't understand these epistemological problems. So like the reception of Pistone and Nicolaus, precisely because the kind of negative quality of their writing is not understood and not taken up as a task intellectually, becomes this like interpretation of economics. And so these students will go out and like look for the commodity form, and they'll like find different examples of the commodity form, right? And of course, precisely what appears to be most immediate is actually the most mediated. And so they're completely confused from the start, right? When they write these essays about like fucking, I don't know, waterproof jackets in East Germany or whatever the hell they write about. Anyway, I just wanted to say that because I felt as though that kind of aspect of those readings is really important for Platypus.
Right. I would say that, I've told a lot of you, that a formative, a key moment in my friendship with Chris is that he and I were taking a class with Moish on negative dialectics. And especially under our questioning, Moish couldn't get to the end of the book. He kept going back to the beginning. And we would sort of push him and push him and push him. I loved Moish as a teacher for doing that, because he was confessing that he wasn't sure, which takes an immense amount of confidence to do that in front of a class. This is what would happen when he would try to read volumes 2 and 3 for like the last 10 years of his life, because every time he would teach Capital, he would declare that he's going to make it to the end, and he never did. Right? He would constantly go back and like rehearse volume 1 again and again and again. And there was never a time when he read all 3 volumes of Capital in like a rigorous, disciplined way where the right amount of time was allotted to each one. Instead, there was just sort of time was running out, and right, it was like that. And in a sense, he was dealing with Grossman's problem, right, which is what is the relationship of these different volumes and the different levels of social reality that they are describing, and how do they relate to one another? Things like the transformation problem of price into value, right? Going from the terms of volume 1 to the terms of volume 3, right? These are problems that are really questions of Marxist dialectic, is ultimately what's at issue there, of what I've called Marxist method, right? And why the whole thing, right? Because the fetishism of commodities section is an opening to the whole thing, right? To the whole of 3 volumes, right? It's about like, we are living in a world in which tables are standing up on their hind legs and talking, right? Or dancing, right? We live in a cosmology that is as opaque as the fetishism of the savages is their social life is opaque to them. And the form that that opacity takes is the level of phenomenological social reality at which politics takes place. to the underlying question, right? That's why we'll say, like, we'll kind of cut through that in Platypus pedagogy, and we'll say the achievement of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to open up the possibility of prosecuting the tasks of democracy. Right? That everything that we're dealing with is sort of the symptom that is democracy. Right? What democracy is a vast symptom of capital. Right? It's a symptom of the disintegration of society. You know, again, like a kind of pedagogical shorthand is people who don't have a guaranteed job will demand a guaranteed vote. Right? That universal suffrage democracy is the political form of a society in crisis. But of course, it's much more, you know, what's driving democracy as this kind of phantasmagoria is much deeper than the mere question of unemployment. So what someone like Grossman is doing when he's saying breakdown of capitalism, right? The breakdown of capitalism is the task of democracy, right? The breakdown of capitalism is the task of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? To prosecute the breakdown of capitalism so that it issues negatively in a way that cannot be specified into a new social form, beyond the social relations that have come into contradiction in this society, right? That's what, like, reading Capital is supposed to teach you, right? This is what I mean. Like, it's not like a lesson or a orientation to a political, and it's certainly not a guide to planned economies, right? Which is what, like, the Soviet Union would turn it into, right? They'd be like, well, Department 1 and Department 2.
We have to build our productive forces.
But what that shows you is that you can, you know, this gets to Danny's earlier point, like, you can turn Marx into an economics. Even have a highly productive economy, as the Eastern Bloc did.
I mean, was not the big innovation by Luxemburg in saying we have to read Marx from the original Accumulation chapter, and we have to think that the original Accumulation has to iterate again and again. And this means that we can only understand the value formation from an explanation which is, as Marx said by himself, an extra-economical explanation. And this means we need a political theory.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
An extra-economical explanation. This means we need a political theory. I mean, this is what Marx describes in the original Accumulation chapter, in order to understand how the value form evolved. And Luxemburg said this is right, and this takes place again and again. It's an iterative process. And I mean, if this is true, then this means that there is, and Althusser makes this explicit, an unjustifiable split, as he says, inside in the capital already. So it's not that the split, as Althusser says polemically, takes place between theory and praxis later in Stalinism in the 20s. Althusser says it takes place methodologically, internal in the capital itself. So we have to think when Marx talks about the reduction of the working day, when he talks about the expropriation of farmers in England in the 17th century, he talks about history. Or when he talks at the end of the first volume about the mode of production in the US, he talks about history. He does not talk about the logical form of the value form. But the interesting thing is here, it seems to me, and Luxemburg stresses this very much, that Marx has not a theory about the relation between an historical explanation and an explanation which starts from the logic of the value form. So there is a split internal in the method of Marx by himself, and we have to understand the split, or whether we can overcome this split. But my question would be, is this not what Luxemburg and even Grossman and others in this line, also today, David Harvey and Fraser, thinking about when they try to think Marx from the original accumulation problem?
So I disagree with that split, just
Good.
straight up. That's the case with Marx, and that's why the chapter, of course, is on the so-called primitive accumulation. Because, in other words, he talks about prerequisites and presuppositions, for example, in the Grundrisse. And so it's not about like historical versus logical, and I think even in Engels' review, I think for the Oberfield review, or Knightley, something like that, he says, yes, of course there's a difference between logical and historical, but they seem to converge in a certain way. So I don't think it's like a split there in Marx at all. I think that's merely posited with no justification right there. And not only that, in terms of Rosa Luxemburg in the accumulation of capital, of course, you're always having a repetition of that original accumulation because capitalism is self-disintegrating, right? And so, like, I think people read accumulation of capital like it's about colonies, but really it's about the fact that people are always being, values always being destroyed, and the people are always being thrown out, in a sense, replaying out the revolt of the Third Estate. And so when you consider that history in the last part of Volume 1, of course, it's like repetitive and self-undermining and regressive. And so I don't think there's necessarily like Marx doesn't have a theory of that. I think actually plenty of Marxists were able to recognize the way in which even history becomes self-contradictory. I think Marx talks about this in the Method of Political Economy, for example, when he says, when you look into the past, we can kind of find the present. This is the human anatomy is the key to the ape, and yet at the same time, we can't simply take it as it is with a grano salto, because in fact, we're seeing the past from the present totality. But I guess in terms of your question, I didn't quite follow what the question was.
I mean, it's quite simple. It's a simple question. I mean, you cannot describe from the pure conceptual analysis of how the value formation works, why there is a reduction of the working day, because
Sure.
political forces are at play, and this is
For
what
sure.
you can.
For sure.
Yeah, but this is. I mean, there's a methodological step. There's a methodological gap between both. You need a political explanation, Marx says, for political forces and movement, and you need an economical explanation for the value form.
No, actually,
So,
this
and
is
now the
pretty,
question
this is like
and
super
now-
straightforward, which is simply the fact that chapter 52 of volume 3 is going into the class struggle. And it's simply saying all the categories hitherto, right, all of the chapters, that they all have a presupposed political determination to them, that it's class struggle, that in fact the content of the categories, right, their totality itself is one of a disintegrating society. So even this political economic, and I think this goes back to your question earlier, and I think also Aaron's question, it's like, this is how I feel like capital has become more occluded and opaque to us, is it seems to be like political and economic, and these are kind of like mutually exclusive or on either side. I mean, you're shaking your head in agreement, but then I don't know if it's...
Let me make a stab at this. I'm not entirely sure the force of your question in relating the issue of the logical and the historical exposition of capital to what you're calling the original accumulation, what English speakers will call the primitive accumulation section. What I would say about those matters, and then you can please re-specify your question, is that there's a difference for Marx. Marx begins the way he begins for a lot of reasons. He wants to, first of all, embed himself in the tradition of political economy. And where does Ricardo begin? With the commodity form. That's where Marx begins, right? This is the apex of bourgeois ideology, has reached the scientific recognition that the social form underlying this society is the commodity form of labor. Marx begins there. He derives from it money. And he is thereby doing a unfolding of from what's underlying society to what's apparent. The commodity form is not apparent to our consciousness. What is available is that this is a book, it has certain words in it, it has a certain kind of binding, and it costs $20. Right? It's a thing with a price tag hanging on it. That's not the same thing as what Marx means by the commodity form, right? It's a mode of appearance. Connected to that mode of appearance is, if you will, the consciousness of the sphere of circulation, or we might say bourgeois consciousness, at which things exchange for their equivalents in a world of justice, right? So from the derivation of money, Marx goes to, you know, the sunlit world of freedom, property, and Bentham, right? That notion of like the sunlit world is a notion of like the logical structure of the way things appear, right? Of the way things shine with the light, right? In society. Then you go into the sphere of production, right? And that's where the issue of the historical respecification and development of those categories takes place to the point of their self-contradiction, right? And that's where you get this like cooperation, manufacture, heavy industry, right? At the point of heavy industry, the categories of this society are wholly self-contradictory, right? In the sphere of production. I would say that the movement for socialism is not extraneous to that, right? For Marx, politics is integral to the driving of bourgeois society into self-contradiction. It's a part of it in the bourgeois revolution. The bourgeois revolution is workers demanding to be commodities.
Political economy.
Right, it's workers demanding to not be peasants and serfs. Right, it's a world beyond estates, beyond caste. It's a demand for bourgeois political economy. Bourgeois political economy, of course, is revolutionary. Of course, it's the underlying structure of the Abbé Sieyès' argument in Qu'est-ce que la tiers-état, right? So it's not that it's not political, but then it has a further moment in the emergence of the working class as a demand to be commodities, right? And Marx talks about how this is the generalization of the commodity form, right? The working class demands the Industrial Revolution because you can't be a worker if you have to have a 10 years apprenticeship to some craft, right? Women, children, peasants, straight off the land, they want a job. The Industrial Revolution is adequate to that, right? At no moment is this not political or some sort of logical unfolding, right? And then the struggle over the working day is Marx's way of showing socialism is driving this, the working class is driving this society into crisis, right? If you demand higher wages for shorter days, the only way that can be delivered is by throwing you out of work in the Industrial Revolution. The only way that that can be delivered is through the development of industrial capitalism, right? It's the problem of capitalism is a problem of the struggle for freedom of the working class. But that's Marx's whole point in Volume 1. I would say the question of primitive accumulation is, it's like we have to be 19th century readers. In the 19th century, the world was supposedly one of the gradual subordination of the state to society. That's the history of the world since the 16th century, right? Is that society, bourgeois society is subjugating this old, rotten, feudal state. And it's eliminating slavery, right? Marx is saying, what if as he says in the 18th Brumaire, the history of the modern age is the perfection of the state. Right? What if we look at history in an arch-Hegelian way and say the rise of bourgeois society is the rise of the Bonapartist state? Then we have to tell the rise of capitalism as a story of the force of the state driving people off of their land, funding the slave trade, et cetera, the whole bourgeois story about the bourgeois revolution is presupposed by that chapter on primitive accumulation. It's a negation of it, right? It's Hegel's story of the rise of the Rechtsstaat inverted as a story of the rise of the Bonapartist state, right? I think that section, of course it's reproduced every day, right? Because we're going to demand bourgeois society, and what we're going to get is imperialism. Right? We're going to demand a society in which we can sell our labor and we can work for a reasonable amount of time and we can reproduce, and what that's going to produce is the Industrial Revolution renewed and the cops and the armies and war, right? To the point now that, like, if I tell my students war is a scandal, right, it's not supposed to exist. The founding fathers of my country thought war was supposed to be it was like a relic of the past. It was dying out, like slavery was dying out, according to them. Right? They're like, war is just human nature, right? War is just tribes fighting each other. Like, they have the scandal of it isn't even apparent to them. Just like the scandal of the state. So I would say that the primitive accumulation chapter is Marx's way of treating the scandal of a modern historical epoch caught in a kind of blocked dialectic of state power and war. That's the way, I think there's nothing like it in Volume 2 or Volume 3. I think Marx is telling us in that, like by putting that at the end of Volume 1, he's telling us, this is it, I'm done. Like, I'm not going to publish another fucking book. Because that chapter doesn't actually flow directly out of that exposition. It feels like an appendix to me. I don't know if any of that makes sense to you or addresses your question. I hope it does.
I perfectly understand what you say, but I would not agree, because you describe right now the Capital One like a not very sophisticated version of Hegel's phenomenal theory of spirit. But I think methodologically Althusser is right in saying in all these historical chapters you redescribed right now in the Capital One, there is an interruption with the method. Because you cannot completely deduce all these historical facts, what Marx calls historical genealogy of the value formation, from the internal logic of the value formation. This does not follow. And this is why Marx is very clear in saying this is an extra-economical explanation. And of course, you said it, it's political violence organized by the state. But this, my question was methodologically, this does not follow from the value form analysis.
Right, I think that this is anti-bourgeois Stalinist claptrap, right? And the reason why I say that is because I think that people think that the commodity form and the analysis of the commodity form is an analysis of a logic of domination. And it isn't, right? Political economy is an analysis of freedom. That's what it's about. That's what the whole history of political economy is about, right? Talking about the rise of bourgeois society and workers, in other words, people aren't demanding a form. They aren't demanding the commodity form. They're demanding a society of cooperation, which takes the form of being able to sell the products of your labor to receive the products of other people's labor, right? It's a project of world historic emancipation. the end of feudalism, the end of slavery, the end of patriarchy, right? That's what political economy is about. And the question, I think, in other words, like for Althusser, capital is just a story of domination, right? I don't think so, right? I think for Marx, it's an analysis of a self-contradictory form of freedom, right? This is why I would say that it's not that politics or history comes in. Marx knows, if you're talking about Adam Smith, you're talking about revolution.
You're talking about political economy.
Yeah, you're not talking about some conservative story about like how are we going to exploit people. You're talking about a story of the end of exploitation, right? Where capitalists themselves are just servants of the working class. That's the vision of political economy. Right? They're just going to allot the surplus so as to expand the productive potential of the whole of society, and they're going to be, motivated to do that by the profit motive, etc. And they're good bourgeois, they're English Quakers, right? For Adam Smith, right? These are not people running around on yachts. This isn't a description of like a decadent class, right? This is a description of an absolutely essential component of the third estate, right? So Adam Smith, political economy, it's not the formation of cooperation and manufacture, right? Those are expansion of the productive capacities of man in a system of cooperation, which then explodes in the Industrial Revolution, where our capacities to work seem to even become freed from scarcity itself, right? Harnessing the power of our comprehension of the laws of nature. And so I think that Althusser just is really off on the whole thing, and it starts with his critique of humanism. Right? It starts with his incomprehension of the relationship of Marxist categories and Marxist project, and indeed socialism itself, to the bourgeois revolution and to liberalism. I hope that's as clear as I can make it.
I think we're we've been going quite long already. I think there's room for a small question if you have it.
Or a short answer.
Okay. Yeah. What? The fridge is refilled, so if you want to, you can get a beer and talk about all of that. So a big thank you once again to Spencer and Danny for coming here and giving us this lecture.